Welcome to the most important week of the year for the podcast industry. Welcome to Podcast Movement 2025.
So my name is Tom Rossi, and you are maybe you're at, if you have your headphones on red, the Understanding Your Podcast Statistics talk. My name is Tom Rossi. I'm with Buzzsprout, so I am on the podcast hosting side, and I spend a lot of my days dealing with podcast statistics, capturing the data, presenting the data to our podcast listeners, or to the all of you podcasters. And so I get this opportunity to be able to walk you through some of the things that we get to see when we look at our podcast statistics and really how we can use them. But the first question that we have to ask is why? Why are you looking at stats? There's good reasons, there's healthy reasons to look at your stats, and then there's not so healthy reasons to look at your stats, okay? And so you know where you are in that relationship, right? The person that hits refresh, like you've got, how many downloads have I gotten in the last 15 seconds since the last time that I hit refresh, right? But you know that you have an outline for your next episode that you're supposed to be working on, but you're hitting refresh on your stats, right? So you have to be careful. So it's funny because it's a talk about stats, but let me start by telling you that you should have a healthy relationship with your stats, which means you shouldn't be living and dying based on those numbers, okay? Most of you, I would venture to say, most, if not all of you, got into podcasting and had nothing to do with numbers, right? There was a message. There was a reason that you got into podcasting. There was something that gave you life that you wanted to share with other people, and you said, you know what, I'm going to start a podcast, and I'm going to talk about this thing, right? But at some point, it starts to shift into, well, how many downloads am I getting? What are my numbers? What are my numbers this week compared to last week? And it can suck the life out of you as a podcaster. So for just a moment, before we start talking about all the numbers, just reconnect with whatever your why was for why you started your podcast, right? Just think for a moment of why you got into it. There are so many good reasons to start a podcast that have nothing to do with your numbers, right? I'll give you a great example. I had a podcast I'm in Jacksonville, Florida, and there's a hospital in Jacksonville. And there was a woman there at the hospital. Her husband got diagnosed with this weird disease that upset the diet, their lifestyle, everything. And she couldn't find any resources for it. So she ended up putting together all these resources, and she said, you know what? I'm going to start a podcast. She started a podcast for a rare disease for people who have family members with this rare disease. Guess what? She's not going to compete with Joe Rogan. She's not going to get those kind of numbers. But every time that somebody downloads her podcast, she's making a difference in their life because she remembers what it was like when nobody could answer those questions, right? She got into podcasting because she had a message that she wanted to get out. Numbers. Now, the numbers matter. Those are real people on the other side of those numbers. But comparing them to others, living by those numbers, judging your success or failure based on those numbers, not a great idea. So, all of that to say, consider what kind of relationship you have with your stats. So, what does a healthy relationship look like? What are questions that I can actually ask my stats that are useful? One of them is, how are my episodes trending? How am I doing as a podcaster in terms of my reach, in terms of the number of people that I'm reaching with the message that I've got? This is a question, it's a healthy question that we can ask and we can get answered by looking at some of our data. So the data that I'm going to be showing you, I'll tell you where it's from, but it might look different depending on where you're hosting your podcast. So this is what it looks like inside of Buzzsprout. In Buzzsprout, we show you how many downloads you get in the first 7 days. Right? So it's showing you how many downloads, when you released an episode, how many downloads did you get in the first 7 days? So your podcast host might show it 30 days, 15 days, whatever it is. But the idea of comparing episode to episode, how many did it get in that first week or in that first month? Because that gives you a good idea of what your reach is. And when I say your reach, I mean, if you were to launch an episode tomorrow, how many people they're going to download it, man? They're your fans. They're following. They're subscribed. They're downloading your episodes when you release them. That's your reach. So People will, well, I've got an episode that's got 1 million downloads. Yeah, but it's 15 years old. That's why it's got so many downloads. See, that would have gotten a laugh if you weren't wearing headphones. That was funny, okay? And it doesn't matter how many downloads you've got. If it's, you can't compare an episode that's 15 years old with an episode that was launched a month ago. So in order to normalize the data so you can compare it, you want to look in the first certain number of days. I recommend a week because most of the people that care about your podcast will download it in that week. Does that make sense? This is a good thing. You can look at how do my episodes compare with one another. So now you notice my more recent episodes are trending a little bit better than my older episodes. So my reach is growing a little bit, right? On average, I've got a little bit better of a following than I did on my older episodes. Notice what happened here. Something went wrong. Something is notably different about that episode. I can tell you what it was because we found out we forgot to send the newsletter. So, healthy relationship with my stats. Is the newsletter helpful for my podcast? Yes. My stats actually help me answer the question, yeah, your newsletter actually impacted how many people are downloading your episodes in the first 7 days. So I can look at this to look for trends. I can look at this to figure out, is there something that I should or should not be repeating in the way that I'm promoting or launching my episodes? Things like that. Oh, this is an exceptionally good episode where we did send the newsletter. Another way to look at it is across the board. So these are all the downloads for the entire podcast over a period of time. And I'm looking at how my episodes are trending. And you notice these peaks. What do you think those are? You'd think. They're when I launch an episode. The big peak is when I launch an episode, all of a sudden my podcast gets downloads. Why? Well, because all of my followers get notified there's a new episode and they download it. But then right after, you notice there's these little peaks. That's the newsletter. So then what happens is after the episode launches, you get an initial rush of downloads. Then we send out our newsletter. We get another rush of downloads. Good information because I want to know if it's worthwhile, the money that I'm spending building and sending out that newsletter. It's substantiated by the stats that I'm seeing. Okay, what's another question that we can ask? What's another question that we can ask of our stats to make our podcast better? One of the questions that we can ask is, what apps are people using when they're listening to my podcast, right? So you can see here all the apps. Again, this is from Buzzsprout. All the different hosts are going to show you this in one way or the other. What apps are people using to listen? So the podcast host actually knows, was it downloaded on Apple? Was it downloaded on Spotify? Was it downloaded on Overcast or Pocket Cast? One of the amazing things that you should not take for granted, about podcasting is there are tons of players available. No one company owns podcasting. Does that make sense? No one company owns podcasting. People can be listening on Apple, they can be listening on Spotify, they can be listening on Pocket Cast or Podcast Addict or Fountain or any of these other players that are out there. Guys, that's unique in content. You don't have that in video. Who owns video? YouTube? Podcasting? Whole different world. Okay, all that to say, knowing what apps people are using can give you a little bit of information about your user base. Does anybody notice anything missing? Spotify, oh my gosh, right? If this was you, the first question I'd ask is, dude, why aren't you getting any downloads on Spotify, right? Now, this particular podcast, they don't want to be on Spotify for reasons in their podcast that they talk about. But what's important for you to know as a podcaster is if you look at your apps, you should see downloads from all of the different players that are out there that you've listed yourself with. With Buzzsprout, we make it super easy to get into all the different directories. With whoever you're using, you want to make sure that you're getting listed in all the different directories. Because if one of them is missing, that's downloads. You probably have an audience there that you're missing. What else? Surprise, mobile. Dude, it's always been that way. It's always been that way. The majority of your downloads are going to be mobile. So that's something that you should know. You should know that people, when they're listening to your podcast, are listening on a mobile device. They're probably doing something else. They're probably driving their car, they're running, they're doing household tasks, they're doing something different. Sorry, my computer keeps going to sleep. Okay, all of that, the type of device that people are using, the apps that they're using. Another question that our stats can answer is, where are people listening from? Where are they coming from? Now, I gotta be honest. This is fun data to look at. I don't know how useful it is as a podcaster. It's encouraging. Oh my gosh, I got a download from Bolivia. Do not waste your time trying to figure out who downloaded your podcast in Bolivia. It's not gonna help. It's not gonna help you with your content, right? So how do I actually use this data to make my podcast better? I can only think of one case where I talked to a podcaster, and what he did was he went all over, him and his co-host, they had gone all over Europe, and they had a comic book podcast, and they went to all these comic book stores all over Europe, and they were dropping off cards about their podcast. They were putting them in all these, and then they watched the downloads from those different places as a result of them dropping it off. Okay, it's a little bit of an ego boost. It's a little bit of a confirmation that, okay, maybe it was worth, dropping those cards off at those different places. But for the most part, looking at location data, it's fun. I don't know how much it really changes the content you're creating, unless maybe you have geographically targeted content. So you're talking about, Greece, and you get a bunch of downloads from Greece. But other than that, I'm not totally sure how much you can really use that. Okay, do people really listen to my podcast? Here's where we start diverging a little bit. So all of the data that I've given you so far is data that you're going to get from the podcast hosting company, from the company that hosts your podcast. But the next question is, but do people really listen? I don't know, okay? That's the honest answer. As a podcast hosting company, we have no idea. All we know is that it was downloaded. And people sometimes say, well, what do you mean by download? What if they stream it? What if they listen to it live while they're running or something like that? We don't know that. All we know is it's being downloaded. The data is being downloaded. Once a certain amount of data is downloaded, we count it as a download, right? There's a standard that most podcast hosts use where if you download 60 seconds worth of data, now we count it as a download. If they just download 10 seconds worth of data, which is really hard to do, if they download 10 seconds worth of data, we don't count it as a download. But what happens if they download it on their device and they never listen to it? Has anybody ever downloaded a podcast episode and not listened to it? We don't know that. So how do I answer the question? How can statistics help me answer the question, do people really listen to my podcast? Well, good news. We can get that information from Apple Podcast Connect, Spotify Podcasters Dashboard. They will tell you how much of your episodes are being consumed. You will not get that information from your podcast hosting company. You'll have to get that from the actual players that are playing it. So here's an example of a podcast episode looking at the consumption inside of Apple. Does anybody notice anything weird? Little dip right there? What do you think that is? The intro. People skip the intro. That's pretty good information. It's good information for you to know. People don't really listen to your intro. They skip right into it. In this case, the Dreamful Bedtime Stories, it's a bedtime story for going to sleep. Somebody cues it up. They don't want to listen to the intro. They skip right over it. They start the story, and then they listen. How much do they listen to it? Well, 89%. 89%. That's massive. Think about that for a second. So this is an episode that's 48 minutes long. 48 minutes long, and you're getting 89% consumption. That's really, really good information. By looking at this, you can see what sections of your podcast maybe they're skipping over. People aren't consuming that, right? You've got a section where you talk about whatever, the news of the day, and people skip right over it, right? You can look at this to see what sections of your podcast are resonating with your audience and which ones aren't. You can also see what percentage is being consumed by your audience. This is the same episode inside of Spotify. So if I take that same episode and I look at it, I can see the same dip, Notice 49% complete. A little bit less consumption on Spotify. People listen to 49% on average versus 89%. How much does that help? It gives you a little bit of information about your listeners that are on Spotify versus your listeners that are on Apple. But still, an incredible amount of consumption, especially when you compare to YouTube. YouTube has recently redefined themselves as the podcast company. People now think that YouTube is a place where people go and listen to podcasts. It's arguable, okay? YouTube's been around a long time. They've been doing video. What about audio versus video? I would recommend looking at your consumption data. How much are people actually consuming of the podcast? I have people all the time that are saying, well, I don't understand because I have way more views on YouTube than I have on Apple Podcasts. Well, but look at the consumption. What happens on Apple? Average view duration, 2 minutes and 38 seconds. So this is that same episode that on Apple we saw 89%, on Spotify we saw 49%, and now we're seeing 2 minutes and 38 seconds or 5.4% consumption on YouTube. So what does that mean for you as a podcaster? Well, that a YouTube view isn't as valuable as a Apple download. That's the most valuable because they're downloading 89% or they're listening to 89% of the content. Spotify, 50%, and then 5% on YouTube. And I know what you're thinking, okay, yeah, but this episode might just suck. In this case, this episode is just an audio. Have you seen where you can take your audio and you can upload it to YouTube and it just puts your artwork and it does a little Enneagram? Not an Enneagram. It's totally different. Enneagrams, it's fun, it's cool, but it's totally different than an audiogram. This is an audiogram. And what it shows, well, maybe that's just not very popular. So let's take a look at another episode. This is an episode that we did with 3 cameras. So we went, Buzzsprout, we have a podcast called Buzzcast. We also do tons of stuff on our YouTube channel. We have over 100,000 followers on our YouTube channel. And so we build videos to help people with podcasting. So we're like, okay, we're going all in on video, man. So we had 3 cameras. We had a script, and we built this video. Take a look at the consumption. 3 minutes. 3 minutes! How much money did we spend on this freaking video? We're getting 3 minutes, right? Now that same episode, if you take it and you compare that exact same episode inside of Apple Podcasts, we get 94% consumption. Oh my gosh. Needless to say, we don't spend as much money on video as we did. We did for about a year. We had the whole setup, and then we tore it down. It just wasn't worth the effort, the amount of effort required for editing, for being able to record it and do all the things that are necessary for a video. It just wasn't worth it for us. Your numbers might be different, but I would encourage you, when we're talking about a healthy relationship with stats and questions that you can ask, one of the questions you should be asking is how much consumption is happening for my videos? Because if people are consuming 3 minutes of it, why are you spending time building 50 minutes of video? Nobody's watching it. They're watching 3 minutes. Build 3 minutes of compelling video content versus 50 minutes, or trying to make 50 minutes. Okay, what else can I learn about my listeners? Okay, so this, I have some opinions about, which maybe you might be able to glean from the way that I present this information. But what else can I learn? What else can I learn about my listeners? Age demographics. How old are my listeners? This is what I call creepy, okay? These are what we call creepy statistics, right? It's good information, but it's just a little creepy. What's the average age of my listener? Now, again, you're not gonna get that from your podcast hosting company, but you can get that from Spotify, because Spotify doesn't care about being creepy. They ask them, and then they share that information with you. I would just recommend that you not share that with your listeners, because they might wonder how you know what their age is if they haven't shared it with you. And I have people that'll come up to me and they're like, well, but how can I find out like what the listener demographic is for my show? Ask them. Ask them. That's a great way to do it. Like, you don't have to rely on statistics to answer it. You can just ask them, hey, I hope you love the show. I would like to know more about you, the listener. I've put a link to a Google survey. Tell me about yourself. You know, that's so much better than I've been looking at you. Okay, age demographics. But hey, it's there. I don't judge you. If you go and you look at this data, Spotify gives it to you. The age demographics, the gender demographics. That can tell you some information about the people that are listening, right? But it's limited only to the Spotify listeners and only to the listeners that shared accurate information with Spotify. Okay, Spotify impressions. This is a really cool piece of information that they've started to share with podcasters, where you can see how many times your podcast was given an impression. So they saw your podcast. And now whether they chose to click and listen to it, that's a good indicator for you whether or not you have good artwork, whether you have good titles and descriptions. So looking at your impressions and then comparing that number to how many people actually downloaded it. So this is really good information that you can only get from Spotify. Okay, how do my numbers compare? This is not bad information. Buzzsprout shares all of our information. Every month we publish our statistics across all of our podcasts. So this was from July 2024. We had 121,000 active podcasts, and then this is all the data associated with it. If you go to buzzsprout.com/stats, you can see all of our numbers. We share it to help encourage podcasters with what's happening in the industry. But you can see some of the data. Spotify accounted for 34% of our downloads for that month. Across all of the podcasts. Across all of the podcasts, it was 34%. Apple Podcast, 32%. Web browser, 8.7. So now you can compare these numbers to your own podcast. If you have a disproportionate number, then that might tell you something about your listener base. I'll give you a great example. A lot of people, a lot of podcasts that have younger audiences will find that they have a disproportionate number of Spotify listeners, because younger people, they didn't even know about Apple Podcasts. They just came in through the Spotify ecosystem. And so you might see your Spotify numbers a little bit higher. What else can I see? Oh, you can see where people are coming from. Again, this is across over 100,000 podcasts. It's still mostly dominated by the US, 45%, and then it drops off sharply to the UK with only 6%. Oh, this number. I love this number. I love this number. I didn't want to share it originally, and then when I started running the analytics, I was like, oh, I definitely want to share this number. What this tells you is if you get 112 downloads in the first 7 days of launching an episode, if you get 112 downloads in the first 7 days of launching an episode, you are in the top 25% of all of the Buzzsprout podcasts. You were in the top 25 with only 112. This is so counterintuitive, right? Because we think that the numbers have to be so massive. And it's because we are just showered with data from the most popular podcasts. But they represent such a small percentage of the number of podcasts, right? So I recommend knowing this number and it changes very little. And the 30 downloads in the first 7 days, I mean, it's been that way pretty much since the beginning of us tracking these numbers. That if you get that many downloads in the first 7 days, you're in the top 50% of podcasts that are out there. That's encouraging. That will help you keep podcasting. Episode duration, we just give you this information. It's not prescriptive. It's not telling you how to be successful. But it is worth knowing that 62% are less than 40 minutes. 62% of the episodes that were published on Buzzsprout in that month were less than 40 minutes. So it gives you an idea of how you might stack up. Now, I listened to a podcast, I kid you not. I listened to a podcast 2 weeks ago. It was 6 hours long, and it was awesome, okay? The question is, how long can you not be boring? That's how long your episode should be, right? How long can you be engaging? How long can you be entertaining? Now, this was a 6-hour podcast with somebody that I really wanted to hear talk. Well, I will listen to every minute of that, right? And so don't use this as your determining factor of how long your episode should be. It's good reference information, but the real question is, how long can you not be boring? That's how long your episode should be. How often do you publish? So again, this is looking across all the Buzzsprout podcasts, and you can see whatever 40% are 7 days or less publishing between each episode, right? So depending on your rhythm, I think it's most important to be consistent, but this is good information for you to be aware of. And that is it for podcasting stats. And look, we have 5 minutes, so we have time for a couple questions. She's going to bring a microphone over.
Thank you. When you're looking at the stats and it says website, what is, I know that's not the embed player, for example, like I put on my company's website an embed player for our pod. What is the web browser?
Web browser just means that it was downloaded from a web browser, but we don't know anything else, right? Now, if it was a web browser and they followed a link from the embedded player, we know that. So that is a web player too, but we know that it was actually the embedded player, so we attribute it to the embedded player. Questions? She's got to bring the mic around.
Thank you. Okay, back with more questions. I actually have two, so you can tell me what makes the most sense. One, so my podcast is on the African immigrant experience. My podcast is on the African immigrant experience. So we do have a pretty global audience in that sense. Does location data make sense for me? Second question, can you explain in this, like really get into the detail of what is a download? Because as a consumer, I don't know if like sometimes Apple will auto download things for me. Sometimes I don't have storage, so I turn it off. Does that still count to somebody as a download? Because I just go in and press play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, wait, so real quick, two questions. The first question was about statistics and like does locations matter for my particular podcast? My question for you always, because people write in and they go, I want to know how many people download on Tuesday using Firefox version 35. And I'm like, what are you going to do with that information? How is that going to help you as a podcaster create better content? How is that going to help you connect with your audience? What is it going to do? What is actionable about the information that you're looking at? And so if you have an answer for that question, by all means, look at the data, right? If you have an actionable step that you can take as a result of looking at the data, go for it. But in my experience, it's very rare that looking at location data gives you that information. The other question was, what is a download? What is a download? This is unfortunately a very common question because there's so many different words that people use. All right? From the hosting company's perspective, a download happens whenever 60 seconds worth of data is downloaded. Whether it was streaming because they were listening on an embedded player on your website, whether they downloaded it from Spotify, whether they downloaded it from Apple, it doesn't matter. If they downloaded it on their device and they never listened to it, we don't know. All we know is it was downloaded, right? The only way to find out if it was actually listened to is to go to the player and look at the consumption data. Question? Oh, 2 minutes. Yell it out. Here.
Is it me? Oh, okay. The question, great presentation. The question I have is about retention of people who subscribe and follow, because you can get that information on what percentage of people who listen to your podcast are followers versus non-followers, and how do I gauge? How does the podcaster gauge how many people are we able to retain? Like, because it's important for us, because it takes a lot of effort to get somebody to follow you. And every time I look at my numbers, people are following and people are unfollowing. But I want to see how many people who follow continue listening and sticking around. So is there a way to get to that trend or info?
So the question is about looking at followers, and what's important about the whole concept of a follower is it's tied to the player, right? It's tied to Spotify, it's tied to Apple, and how many people are actually following. Those numbers are meaningless. How many followers you have is meaningless if they don't translate into downloads in the first 7 days, right? If somebody's following the podcast, they should be downloading it in the first 7 days. There was a company that shall remain nameless that was selling promotional services. If anyone is selling you promotional services, be afraid, okay? Like, I'm not saying that there aren't legitimate ones out there, but there are way more that are not legitimate. But what they were doing is they were selling followers. And so what you had were all these podcasts that had this massive number of followers, but nobody was downloading. They hit the metric, but it wasn't really the metric that mattered. And so I hesitate to look at the follower number because it should be resulting in the number of downloads happening in the first 7 days. And that is across all the platforms. And if that number is going up, that means your reach is getting better. If that number is going down, that means your reach is getting worse. That's what I recommend looking at. You can look at the follower numbers and you can try to gauge retention within Apple and within Spotify, but they don't make it easy. And I'm not sure that that's better than looking at the downloads.
Yeah, it's not so much I'm looking at the follower numbers. It's more like downloads based on follower numbers. Like just trying to gauge if people are sticking around or not.
Yeah.
If if people just subscribe and never come back, I mean that's like wasted effort. Yeah.
If the number of downloads happening in the first 7 days is going up, then they got to be sticking around, right? Or you're churning them out. You're getting so many new ones that you can churn out the old ones. You know what I mean? One more question. Oh, wait, we're out. Is that it? I'll be around. If anybody has any questions, I'll be down here right after the talk, and I'll also be back at the Buzzsprout booth for the rest of the day today and tomorrow. So thanks for coming out. Thanks for listening.